Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the BCCIE Morning Coffee Series. Get your hot beverage, pull up a chair, and let's talk. My name is Jane Gatewood, and I serve as Vice Provost for Global Engagement at the University of Rochester in New York State. It is my pleasure to be with you all this morning to talk about geopolitics in the academy, about foreign policy in universities. Many thanks to Randall Martin and the team at BCCIE for inviting me to participate in this morning coffee series. I recently had the pleasure of talking with colleagues, including Randall, about this topic at the EAIE conference in Barcelona. Our session was well attended and the audience was very engaged. I hope to continue the conversation here and beyond with you all this morning. By way of background, in a smaller meeting last fall with fellow senior international officers and those in similar roles across the world, we found ourselves musing about how our roles had changed as a result of the pandemic. And we were wondering how our roles would change in the near and longer term, due at least to a sense of increasing geopolitical conflict. So the topic of do universities need a foreign policy emerged, but we weren't the first to ask the question. In June 2021, Karen Fisher asked in the Chronicle of Higher Education whether colleges needed a foreign policy, noting recent cases of campus unrest related to global engagement actions or programs by universities. Among them was the potential dual degree program between an Ivy League US institution and a top-ranked institution in China. The US institution's professors had expressed alarm given the Chinese government's human rights records, concern about academic freedom on Chinese campuses, as well as treatment of student activists. This is not the first time such an issue related to concerns over academic freedom and institutional values has occurred in relation to a university's branch campus. Indeed, several years ago, New York University faculty protested similarly in engagement with NYU's branch campus in Abu Dhabi. Before campuses were considering branches in foreign locations, though, back in the 1980s, UC Berkeley students staged protests against the University of California system and their engagement with South Africa during apartheid. And these protests ultimately forced the UC system to divest billions that it held in companies doing business with South Africa. These calls are echoed now by students in various countries calling for divestment from Israel due to treatment of Palestinians. But student protests are nothing new. So how is what is happening now different from, as well as an extension of, what has come before? Institutions are more globally engaged now than they were 40 years ago, so perhaps the stakes are higher or different. And what does it mean for universities operating in an increasingly complex, multipolar geopolitical space? One that can be rife with viral social media, cancellations and shoutdowns of invited speakers or guests, demands for apologies from various constituents, and the like. This is the space where public relations and brand management collide with geopolitics on campus. This occurred at my own institution in the fall of 2019 with various student protests about Hong Kong and the perception of an institutional display celebrating the international student body. And admittedly, we could have been better positioned to manage and respond to it, perhaps even prevent it altogether. Even more complex, it's not just students and faculty protesting institutional actions. Governments have halted foreign degree recognition when institutions behave in ways they find troubling. For example, the Chinese Ministry of Education halted degree recognition for a Canadian university after that institution awarded the Dalai Lama an honorary degree in 2010. In the US, as well as in Canada, the UK, and Australia, governments are increasingly concerned about so-called malign foreign influence in the academic environment, particularly in the federally funded academic research enterprise. And the relationship between governments and universities becomes a key factor in considering whether universities need a so-called foreign policy. Governments are key funders of higher education institutions through tuition subsidies, research funding, and other mechanisms depending on the local context. In the US, even though we do not have a federal system for higher education, states play a key role in supporting public institutions, and the US federal government is a primary funder of academic research. Even in the case of private nonprofit institutions such as mine, the federal funding we receive to support research is substantial. And it is through this channel, access to research funding, that governments are expressing concern about the potential for malign foreign influence. In the US, it is through this channel that the federal government has signaled it will establish additional oversight for institutions' international connections and activities. And I suspect that this changing environment will prompt many institutions to rethink their international connections, asking more questions about where, why, with whom, and for what purposes they are engaged globally. These are useful questions, and for those of us involved in international strategic engagement for institutions, these questions are foundational. A challenge now, though, is the framing. Are we entering a new era of increased scrutiny? Quite possibly. And how does this meld with foundational principles of open collaboration and freedom of inquiry? Does this shift the traditional role of education as a key player in soft power and public diplomacy? I wish I had firm or easy answers to these questions, but I think these are questions that the field of international education needs to begin to contemplate, and quickly. So we have a number of key issues intersecting and at times colliding: academic freedom, freedom of speech and expression, institutional alliances, formal and informal collaborations, funding sources for research, and increased government interest and possible oversight. Much of this change is no doubt emerging due to the changing geopolitical landscape globally. We are no longer in a unipolar or even a bipolar world of the post-World War II Cold War era. We are now in a multipolar era, and that multipolarity brings with it increased dynamism and complexity. And this dynamism and complexity extends to higher education activities. It is reasonable to assume that we will see increased complexity, increasing gray areas in our institutional activities abroad. So within all of this complexity, how are we supposed to operate, much less lead as international educators? If universities were to create a foreign policy, it would need to be both comprehensive, ranging from everything from investment practices to student experience and research, and it would need to be flexible. It might be an in-house component of a larger, more public institutional strategy. It would need to ensure academic freedom and student agency and voice, while also prescribing institutional action, separating institutional action from that of the faculty and of the students. Some additional elements to consider when contemplating a university foreign policy include: do you already have an international strategy? Does it speak to any of the issues attendant to increased geopolitical complexity and domestic as well as foreign government scrutiny? Finally, does your institution have institutional value statements? Do your institutional global strategy for engagement and actions align with these stated values? Does your institution have partnership priorities and global engagement principles? Can these be fine-tuned or updated in light of the changes in the geopolitical landscape? There's a lot to ponder here, and there's a lot to react to. I look forward to hearing from everyone and to continuing the conversation regarding this really complex and interesting topic. Thank you. Enjoy your day.